Hey guys! Today we're going to be talking about the African diaspora in Australia.
Freedom is
Before we begin, I'd like to dedicate this video to one of my closest friends, Natalie Claremont, who was herself an Australian woman of African descent. Nat was one of the biggest supporters of this project right from the get-go. She watched every single video and she was really looking forward to seeing this episode on the African diaspora in Australia, of which she herself was a part. Sadly, Nat passed away in June, so I would like to dedicate this video to her. Natalie, this one's for you, sis. There is a saying in Australia, white Australia has a black history. This refers to the difficulty Australia has faced in confronting its oppressive colonial past and treatment of the Aboriginal community. Although the term black is often used to refer to Australia's Indigenous Aboriginal community, for the purposes of this video, we'll be focusing on the history of the African diaspora in Australia. The African diaspora in Australia is relatively recent. Over 70% of African emigrants to Australia are from Southern and Eastern Africa. We'll speak more about the modern African diaspora later, but first, let's take a look at Australian history. The Australian mainland has been inhabited by Indigenous Aborigines for tens of thousands of years. The oldest foreign artefacts ever discovered in Australia are coins minted by the medieval kingdom of the Kilwa Sultanate, the equivalent of modern-day Tanzania, found on the Wessel Islands, which indicates trade with Africa from as early as the 12th century. The first documented arrival of Europeans to Australia was in 1606 by the Dutch explorer Willem Jasoen. The first British explorers arrived in 1770, when James Cook charted the east coast of Australia for Great Britain. The first fleet of British ships arrived in 1788 at Botany Bay, which is located in modern-day Sydney. They established a penal colony on the mainland, which was populated by exiled British convicts. Over time, the British ventured further into the interior and established other colonies, decimating Indigenous Aboriginal communities through war and disease. You may be wondering what this has to do with people of African descent. Well, much of the money that went into establishing British colonies in Australia was financed by Britain's involvement in the Transatlantic slave trade. Several figures have been documented as migrating to Australia after their families acquired wealth from the slave trade. In 1835, the British government paid out £20 million in compensation to former slave owners, the equivalent of £300 billion today, a sum which the government didn't finish paying off until 2015. The database created by the Centre for the Study of the Legacies of British Slave Ownership details many prominent European settlers in Australia who benefited financially from the slave trade. They include the former Mayor of Melbourne, Godfrey Downes Carter, Reverend Robert Allwood, Vice-Chancellor of Sydney University, Archibald Paul Burt, the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Western Australia, and Charles Edward Bright, the President of the Melbourne Chamber of Commerce. The Australian Dictionary of Biography has been heavily criticised for failing to detail the slave trading past or association of many of the people listed. This reflects a tendency by generations of Australian historians, politicians and writers to be selective about the way in which Australian history is recounted, in favour of a version of events that glamorises or downplays British colonial rule. Gold rushes and agricultural industries brought prosperity to the colonies. In particular, the wool industry was highly lucrative for British colonisers, as were the gold rushes once gold was discovered in Australia in 1851. Not only did aristocrats and traders prosper, but many of the convicts that had been exiled to Australia were able to set up their own businesses and thrive. People of African descent arrived via the First Fleet in 1788 and throughout the 19th century. Billy Blue was a black convict and former British Army veteran who was transported to Botany Bay on the convict ship Minorca. He arrived in Sydney in 1801 to serve the remaining 2 years of his sentence. Upon his release, he married an English former convict, Elizabeth Williams, and together they had 6 children. Billy became a boatman, ferrying passengers across Sydney Harbour. Blues Point on Sydney Harbour and Blue Street, Blues Point Tower and the Billy Blue College of Design are all named after him. John Caesar, nicknamed Black Caesar, was the first Australian bushranger and one of the first people of African descent to arrive in Australia. Born in the West Indies, he worked as a servant in England before being convicted of stealing and was transported to Australia as part of the First Fleet in 1788. Caesar escaped 4 times during his sentence, including once in a stolen canoe, but was eventually caught or handed himself in. However, the 4th time, he was wounded by bounty hunters and died. He was survived by fellow convict Anne Powers and their daughter, also named Anne. Black Jack Anderson was an African-American pirate and seal hunter who operated off the coast of Western Australia. He arrived in 1826 on the American vessel Vigilant and escaped to the Recherche Archipelago. It was heavily populated by sea lions, and Black Jack Anderson made his money by trading furs along the coast. They also pirated by robbing passing ships and trafficking indigenous Kaurna women as sex slaves. Black Jack Anderson was eventually murdered by his fellow pirates. In 1901, the 6 British colonies in Australia united to form the Federation of Australia. You might be interested to know that there was an Australian Black Panther Party. It was formed in 1971 by Aboriginal political activists Dennis Walker and Sam Watson, who were inspired by the civil rights movement in the US. So, when did Africans start arriving in Australia in large numbers? The oldest African diaspora group in Australia is the Mauritian community, which began long before the Australian Federation came into being in 1901. This trade relationship began in the early 1800s, when Australia began importing Mauritian sugar. In general, the African diaspora in Australia as we know it today is relatively recent. During the 1960s, the Special Commonwealth African Assistance Plan facilitated students from Commonwealth African countries travelling to Australia, where many of them chose to stay. Australia also received a large influx of white African migrants from Kenya, Zimbabwe, and most of all South Africa, following the end of white colonial rule in those countries, most notably apartheid. In more recent years, African migrants have entered Australia for a number of reasons, whether as skilled workers, through family connections, or on humanitarian programs. The largest African diaspora communities in Australia hail from South Africa, Zimbabwe, Sudan, Mauritius, and Kenya. One of the more recent African diaspora communities in Australia is the Sudanese community. Plagued by drought, famine, political instability and war, there has been a large influx of Sudanese migrants to Australia since the end of the 20th century. From 1997 to 2007, over 20,000 Sudanese people migrated to Australia. There has been a mixed response in Australia to the increased influx of African migrants, and there has been a notable difference in the public response to the migration of white Africans versus black Africans. In 2007, the Australian Immigration Minister, Kevin Andrews, published a list of concerns over African migrants, including race-based gangs, alcohol abuse, and bar fights. A week later, an 18-year-old man of Sudanese origin, Lieb Goni, who had lived in Australia for almost a decade, was murdered by a group of men in what was described as an unprovoked, racially motivated attack. In spite of some of the challenges, there are many Australians of African descent who have thrived and achieved amazing things. Famous Afro-Australians include the model Adut Aket, TV presenter Faustina Agoli, social activist Bahan Ahmed, actress Amelia Burns, rapper Diaspora, and lawyer and human rights activist Nyadol Nuon. And that's it for our video on the African diaspora in Australia. If you enjoyed that, then please do check out the other videos on the channel. And for a daily dose of Black history content, find me on Instagram at FreedomIsMineOfficial. As always, I'll see you in the next video. Freedom.